Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm finishing with the historical evidence for the resurrection video from the channel The Study of Christianity. Last time, we finished off with his claim that Christianity being slightly different from the other mystery cults of the time and place somehow counts as evidence for the resurrection, which it absolutely does not. Scientology is completely different from any other religions that I am aware of. Does that count as evidence that Scientology is true? If not, then neither does the uniqueness of Christianity. Anyway, on to the next bit of evidence.
The next historical method we shall use is that of the criterion of embarrassment.
Judging by how he's misused the other historical criteria up to this point, I'm half expecting this to be a claim that some evangelical Christians are too embarrassed to share their faith, therefore it must be true. But just to preface this, the criterion of embarrassment is not generally used outside of New Testament studies. Occasionally you can find references to historians who mention that they think some detail of an account is true because it looks like a detail that might have been left out if the author could get away with the omission, but they can't because it's actually true and well known. But it's a criterion that comes with a second assumption, that we actually know what would be embarrassing to the people who are writing the story. Sure, we can build a case as to why we think something might have been embarrassing to them, but we can't know for certain what emotions the author would have been feeling when writing the story.
This simply states that when individuals make up or embellishes an account, they normally do so in order to strengthen their position.
Yes. And sometimes, strengthening your position can involve making up details that might be considered embarrassing in order to give yourself plausible deniability. My first time playing Among Us on a group voice call was not my first time playing Among Us, but the people on the call didn't know that. So when I was seen on camera going into a vent and then was called out for it, I feigned incredulity at the idea that the imposter could go into vents. Imposters can go into vents? I didn't know that. I'll be sure to remember that next time I'm imposter. It was embarrassing to admit a lack of knowledge about the game we were playing, but this embarrassing detail gave my story extra credibility, and I did not get voted off that round. Use of the criterion of embarrassment means that you need to know two things first. Are the details actually embarrassing to the author, and was the author motivated to include these details in order to make their story more believable? These are two pretty big assumptions, and so this criterion is used very, very sparingly outside of New Testament studies, and never as the cornerstone of an argument.
It is very unlikely that one would embellish a story that would incorporate elements that would weaken or embarrass them.
Unless those embarrassing elements would lend extra credibility to the story.
Therefore, the criterion of embarrassment contends that an embarrassing story, one that does not serve the interest of the author, is likely to be historical.
But before making that determination, you first have to figure out what the author's intentions actually were. If they're just making stuff up and including embarrassing details in order to make their story look more plausible, then they're not just going to write down that that is what they are doing. You can only work on inference here.
Keeping this in mind, let us now begin to survey the status of women in first century Palestine. In this time, when a woman was pregnant, they would pray for the unborn child that, "O God, let not my offspring be a girl, for very wretched is the life of a woman."
You don't have to go back to first century Palestine for that sort of thing. There are Jewish sects around today where the men start their days off with a morning prayer that includes the line, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has not created me a woman." Given the Bible's general disdain for women, including verses telling them to remain silent, saying that they cannot have authority over a man, treating them as property to be bought from their fathers, and stuff like that, I'd say that, yes, women who lived when the Bible was being written were treated as second-class citizens at best.
When it came to the idea of educating women, it was said, "Sooner let the words of the law be burnt than taught to women." And here is an example of a prayer for a Jewish man at that time. One ought to say 3 blessings every day. "Blessed is he that did not make me a Gentile. Blessed is he that did not make me a woman. Blessed is he who did not make me brutish."
Yeah, these 3 things from Judaism, the religion that led to Christianity. You sure you want to bring this stuff up to help you prove that Christianity is true? Because if Christianity is true, then that means that this stuff was passed down to humanity from the God of Christianity just before Christ came along.
Now, when it comes to the testimony of women, things don't get better. One author writes at the time, But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of their levity and boldness of their sex. Another, any evidence which a woman gives is not valid. And finally, wherever the Torah accepts the testimony of one witness, it follows the majority of persons, so that 2 women against 1 man is identical with 2 men against 1 man. But there are some who declare that wherever a competent witness came first, even 100 women are regarded as equal to 1 witness.
Yes, women's status as legal witnesses was weak at best. So, what's the relevance here? Are you suggesting that there was an ancient court battle about the resurrection? Because being regarded as an unreliable court witness does not mean that you would be regarded as unreliable in general. In fact, the Bible regularly acknowledges how powerful a woman's influence can be over her family. This influence is explicitly stated as the reason the Israelites were not to take wives from foreign nations. They will exert their influence to cause the Jewish men to stray from their worship of Yahweh. Hell, the story of Samson and Delilah is all about how a woman can be your downfall. So, not very much legal status, but plenty of influence in domestic affairs, including religion.
Concerning his death, we read, "Some women were watching from a distance. Among them was Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome." Concerning his burial, we read, "Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where the tomb was laid." And concerning his resurrection, we read, "When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body."
I don't know, man. These don't really strike me as embarrassing details, even given women's lowly legal status. Realistically, anointing the body was considered women's work at the time, so to have men go anoint the body would just be weird. As for the rest, I could see those being the result of the lowly opinion of women. They were so emotional that despite the potential danger to themselves, they had to cry at Jesus' feet while he died. But notice a tomb story. It's not a woman who takes Jesus' body and provides the tomb. That's a man, Joseph of Arimathea. That would have been something unusual and worth remarking on had it been a rich woman who had placed him in her tomb. But yeah, there is nothing remarkable about any of the women's roles here. And that's also ignoring the fact that there was, according to the Gospel of John at least one of Jesus' male disciples at the crucifixion, specifically the disciple whom Jesus loved, who Jesus instructs to take care of his mother after he dies. I skipped it earlier, but he did mention the male disciples all running away right before this section, and so now he is heavily implying that it's only the women who had the courage to stick by Jesus until the end, despite the Bible not actually saying that the female disciples didn't run when they arrested Jesus, and at least one male disciple still showed back up for the crucifixion.
Richard Bauckham, a New Testament scholar, in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, writes, "All 3 synoptic Gospels repeatedly make the women the subjects of verbs of saying they saw the events as Jesus died. They saw where he was laid in the tomb. They saw the stone roll away. They saw the young man sitting on the right side, and the angel invited them to see the empty place where Jesus' body had lain." It could hardly be clearer. The Gospels are appealing to their role as eyewitnesses.
Yeah, but the account goes differently depending on which gospel you're reading in. All 4 disagree on how many women there were. They disagree on whether or not Mary Magdalene recognized Jesus, on whether the stone covering the tomb had been rolled away before or after the women arrived, on how many angels, or men, were present when they got there, on whether or not there were soldiers guarding the tomb, on whether or not there was an earthquake, on whether or not the women actually told anyone what they saw. And in the books that do have them telling people, it's quite telling that the first thing they do is go get the men so that they can corroborate their story. And at least in Luke, the Bible goes out of its way to explain that nobody believed them until their story was verified by a man. This would be more impressive if the resurrection account wasn't one of the most contradictory stories in the Bible. And as for the embarrassment, it would work a lot better if preparing the body wasn't already considered women's work in their culture, and it would at least appear more embarrassing if they didn't explicitly mention that nobody believed the women until a man verified their story.
Given the low status of a woman's testimony, we should be shocked that the first person to witness the most important moment of Christ's life is Mary Magdalene, as she is the first person to see the raised Christ.
I mean, she's present in all the books, but she's not always alone. Why not bring up Mary the mother of James, or Joanna? They were there too, sometimes. And actually, Mary the mother of James and Joanna are in the book of Luke, which doesn't actually have a risen Jesus showing up to anyone at the empty tomb. It instead saves his first appearance for his 2 male disciples on their way to Emmaus. So again, depending on which gospel you're reading, Jesus' first appearance was to men.
One of the first attackers of Christianity is the 2nd century Greek philosopher Celsus. He seizes upon this moment saying, "After death he rose again, and showed the marks of his punishment, and how his hands had been pierced. But who saw this? A hysterical female, as you say, and perhaps some other of those who had been deluded by the same sorcery."
Couple of things here. Firstly, we don't actually have the original writings of Celsus. We have excerpts of his writings from Origen's apologetic book Contra Celsum, so we have no way of knowing whether Origen was accurately representing Celsus. Second, from Origen's book, we gather that in this particular passage, Celsus is speaking from the mouth of a hypothetical Jewish character that he created for illustrative purposes. And while it is apparent that Celsus had a better knowledge of Jewish and Christian writings than most anti-Christian writers of his era, we still have to keep in mind that he is writing this from a Jewish perspective. And given the whole Jewish men start their day thanking God for not making them women thing, this isn't really a surprising take on that argument. And notably, Origen doesn't address this aspect of it, instead focusing on the earlier portion where he talks about how every religion has famous magicians touting themselves as miracle workers. Origen's response is to turn the argument against Moses, which I find moderately amusing.
The New Testament historian N.T. Wright from Oxford writes, "Put Mary there, from the point of view of a Christian wanting to explain to a skeptical audience that Jesus really did rise from the dead is like shooting themselves in the foot. But to us as historians, this kind of thing is gold dust. The early Christians would never have made this up."
I really don't understand how a story of women doing women's work is supposed to be this amazingly embarrassing admission on the author's behalf. Like, would it not be more embarrassing to have the men doing the women's work? And the fact that the men don't believe the women until they verify it for themselves, to me, looks like they're trying to get more reliable eyewitnesses in the men characters without having to stoop to having men doing the women's work. I don't see how this aspect of the story is supposed to have been embarrassing for the gospel authors.
Next we shall ask, what is the scholarly consensus concerning the historicity of the resurrection?
This is where it might actually get interesting, because, you see, it's rare for non-Christians to devote themselves to New Testament studies, and often the scholars who do study the New Testament find themselves working for Christian schools that have them signing statements of faith affirming the core tenets of Christianity, which includes the resurrection last I checked. But even with all this, from the most obviously biased Christian scholars working in the field, we still get waffling on the subject, because there just isn't enough evidence to conclusively support an actual resurrection. The closest they can come is the disciples believed he was resurrected.
Gerd Ludemann writes, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ."
Yes, they had experiences. They were convinced that Jesus appeared to them. This does not mean that he actually did appear to them. This means that they believed that he did. And it is entirely plausible that all of Christianity could have stemmed from just one post-death bereavement hallucination, or even just that one disciple, which probably would have been Peter, deciding that the message of Jesus was important enough to spread, even if it meant not being entirely truthful about his alleged resurrection. Personally, I find the hallucination version of events more compelling, but it's not like lying for Jesus is unheard of.
Bart Ehrman writes, "We can say with complete certainty that some of his disciples at some later time insisted that he soon appeared to them, convincing them that he had been raised from the dead."
I can see why you'd think that quoting Ehrman would help your case, but really, Bart Ehrman is not a Christian. You are trying to provide evidence that the scholarly consensus is that the resurrection is an historical fact. You then, to support this claim, quote an historian that doesn't believe in the resurrection. Yes, he believes that some of the disciples were convinced that Jesus came back to life. That does not make Jesus' return from death more probable than any number of well-documented natural phenomena that could account for the disciples believing such a thing without it actually having happened.
Therefore, most historians will affirm that the apostles had an experience of the risen Christ.
Yes, most will affirm that. But you won't find any consensus around the actual resurrection being an historical event.
Then Paul, who was actually persecuting Christians at the time, also had an experience of the risen Christ.
Yeah, dude had a vision. Hallucinations happen. It could have been brought on by his having a psychotic break as a result of feeling guilt over the persecution of the Christians. Next, he plays a lengthy clip of Bart Ehrman in a debate, which he seems to think helps his case. But Ehrman essentially goes through and explains why hallucinations are a better explanation than an actual resurrection. So I'm not sure why he's playing it, but rather than play the whole thing, I'll just play the end for you.
I think the best explanation is that the disciples of Jesus had visionary experiences, and they interpreted these as, in fact, being visions of Jesus, who was alive afterwards.
See? That's what I've been saying. Bereavement hallucinations are fairly common. Only one is needed, but more than one is not only possible, but entirely plausible. Remember how history is a probability game where you don't take any one source at its word, instead using other sources to figure out how probable it is that the first source is telling the truth? Given what we know of hallucinations, and given what we know of how death works, it is much more probable that a few disciples hallucinated Jesus than Jesus actually came back from the dead.
Therefore, Bart Ehrman contends that the appearances of Christ were visionary hallucinations. However, there is another view espoused by scholars. For example, Paula Fredrickson from Princeton University, who is Jewish, says, "I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they saw, and all the historic evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw, but I do know, as an historian, that they must have seen something."
You're not very good at this, are you? They must have seen something is in no way saying that the something that they saw must have actually happened and been accurately reported decades later by anonymous authors who likely never even met the original disciples who did the seeing.
Therefore, as we now return to our criteria, we can say that we have the criterion of embarrassment, the criterion of dissimilarity, and the scholarly consensus that the apostles had post-mortem experiences of the risen Christ.
Well, I failed to see what would be embarrassing about women doing women's work and then not being believed when they told a tale of missing bodies until it could be verified by a man. And you grossly misused the criterion of dissimilarity. And the scholarly consensus is that at least some of the disciples had what they believed to be experiences with the risen Jesus, which does not say anything about the likelihood that these experiences actually were the risen Jesus rather than hallucinatory in nature.
We've now concluded our historical investigation of the resurrection.
Really? That's it? Wow. I'm underwhelmed. Well, that's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from David, a new man, who says, yes, language evolution proves God injected a variable to create separation of people. They once spoke one language, which makes perfect sense. Why would man want to not understand other people? If I'm understanding this correctly, David is saying that language evolution proves God because God forced the issue, whereas humans would have chosen to just keep one language, which is just straight up not true. Language evolution is not a voluntary process, it just happens when people are physically separated from others who speak the same language for several generations. The language shifts slightly from generation to generation until they diverge and become two independent languages. This would have happened as humans spread out over the planet anyway. And what's more, we can often track the geographic spread of humanity using a phylogeny of languages. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Jerry the Berry, David Schinkel, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the embarrassing details that prove the veracity of my channel. If you'd like to prove me right, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts, my P.O. Box address, and my podcast. See you next time.